So, for those who don't know Liz Carlisle is an associate professor in the Environmental Studies program at UC Santa Barbara. She teaches courses on food and farming, unsurprisingly. Liz was born and raised in Montana and got hooked on agriculture while working as an aide to U.S. Senator and organic farmer John Tester. And that formative experience led to a decade of research and writing collaborations with farmers in her home state of Montana. Liz has written 3 books about regenerative farming and agroecology. The first was called Lentil Underground, the next Grain by Grain, and most recently, Healing Grounds, Climate Justice, and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming. And that's what we're going to be hearing Liz talk about today. Some other major foci of Liz's work include food and farm policy, incentivizing soil health practices, and supporting new entry farmers. And in addition to being an incredibly insightful, ethical, and impactful researcher who I admire a lot, Liz is also a musician. And fun fact, spent several years touring rural America as a country singer. And I have to imagine that that experience also shaped some of your insights that we see in your scholarship. So, without further ado, Liz, please, the floor is yours. We are so grateful that you shared your time so generously with us today and are excited to hear about your book.
Oh, thank you so much for that super generous introduction, Katie. And thank you everybody at UVM for hosting me. It's really an honor to get to be part of this series. It's really an exciting time for the Institute. So looking forward to coming and visiting in person at some point too. And thanks everybody for joining. I know everybody's busy, and I'm just so grateful to get to have this conversation with you. Um, Maybe I'll just say a little bit more about kind of what brings me to this work before I jump in. You've heard that beautifully articulated professional bio. And in terms of what really drew me to working on agriculture and working on justice and regeneration in agriculture, for me, it's really rooted in my conversations with my grandmother when I was young, who lost our family farm in the Dust Bowl. And she was really honest with me about what a difficult experience that was, losing their farm, losing their home, losing their livelihood, kind of having to pick up the pieces and restart their lives. And she was also really honest with me that she understood that her father had overplowed that land, that they hadn't gotten good advice for how to take care of that place in Western Nebraska, in the Sandhills country. And so that kind of planted a seed for me. I wanted the kind of connection to land that my grandmother had that seemed to me came from her having had at least some of her life being able to live in that strong relationship with land, raising her own food on the place where she was growing up, getting to know that place. And I also felt a responsibility to try to understand something about what went wrong there in my family's lineage and to be part of a process of repair. And that's a lifelong project, it turns out, to kind of uncover all the layers of what was going wrong there a couple generations after homesteading on Indigenous land, coming from a settler lineage and, moldboard plows and get bigger, get out and all of it. So this project, I think, represents a step along that journey for me, and one that's really focused on understanding how racial justice and regenerative agriculture really need to be addressed in a synergistic way. So I'll just preface a little bit with that. And I want to start us really thinking about this connection between soil and climate, which is something I feel like I've been hearing a lot about. It's been out in mainstream media in recent years. But coming into this project, I still had some really fundamental questions about it. So I'm actually going to start in a really fundamental place here. By now, I'm sure most of you on this call are intimately familiar with the climate problem and its many nuances. But again, just to bring us back to fundamentals for a moment, one really simple way of thinking about climate change is that stuff that used to be underground, primarily carbon, has been released into the atmosphere, wreaking havoc on the climate through the greenhouse effect. And of course, when we talk about stuff that used to be underground that's now polluting the atmosphere, we primarily think about the burning of fossil fuels and the urgent need to transition to a different energy system. And this, of course, is true, but burning fossil fuels isn't the only problem. Again, I know you all on this call are totally familiar with this, is that another means by which underground carbon gets volatilized into the atmosphere is agriculture. And so currently, we see that agriculture and food systems account for about a quarter to a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, right? And there's all these different buckets of that. There's methane that has a lot to do with our industrial animal systems. There's carbon dioxide that has a lot to do with land use change. There's nitrous oxide that has a lot to do with overuse of fertilizer and leaving land bare for big parts of the year. There's a lot of emissions from the food system. But the good news is, of course, agriculture doesn't have to be practiced this way. Every single one of those buckets of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions can be dramatically reduced. We can halt the deforestation. Animals don't have to be raised in confinement. Overuse of nitrogen fertilizer can be curtailed. So there's all kinds of ways that we can reduce these emissions from food and agriculture. But I think those of you who are part of this community are also hungry for something more, which is to say, what about all those agricultural lands that have already been mined of their soil carbon? Are there ways that that carbon might be put back? So we're not just saying agriculture is going to be less of a climate problem, but can we actually get to a place where we're transforming agriculture from a climate problem to a climate solution? And so this has really been the focus of my work over the last, decade, 15 years or so. And I've become part of a movement in the United States around agriculture and climate that has started using this term regenerative agriculture. It's kind of interesting. I sort of got tagged as part of regenerative agriculture before I even really had heard that term, because that wasn't being used widely when I started getting interested in soil health and climate and organic practices, which was the term that a lot of my collaborators were using at the time. But, if you go to a conference or a field day focused on regenerative agriculture, you'll tend to find farmers and scientists and often lots of other interested folks, maybe chefs or food manufacturers or advocates. And there's all this discussion about how do we put carbon back into the soil? You might see somebody hold up two handfuls of soil, one that's dark and brown and crumbly, and one that's kind of pale tan and hard as a rock. And this is generally a before and after demo. And you're likely to hear about the techniques that the farmer used to transform that lifeless hard pan on the left into that carbon-rich earth on the right. And so you might hear about things like cover crops. Again, I know this is a group of people who's intimately familiar with some of these strategies, right? Not only as a way to build up soil carbon, but also reduce runoff and nitrous oxide emissions, and can really benefit farmers with improved resilience to things like drought and floods. We might hear about crop rotation as a way of adding biodiversity and cycling nutrients, and then bonus, breaking up pest and disease cycles and maybe helping farmers diversify their income. Other kinds of things you hear about a lot in these spaces would be things like minimizing tillage. So maybe people are, experimenting with things like roller crimpers and trying to go no-till. Maybe they're just experimenting with lighter equipment or fewer passes, but thinking about how to disrupt the soil microbial communities a little bit less. And then for folks who have animals or who are borrowing them from a neighbor or collaborating, you might hear about ways that they're rotating those animals through pastures in ways that mimic the grazing behaviors of native herbivores. So this high intensity, short duration, right? Come, eat that yummy forage like this cow is doing there, poop, right? And then go away for a while it grows back, and building up the vegetation and the soil carbon that way. So lots of interest in these regenerative practices right now, as I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with, right? This has become much more of a mainstream discussion. It used to be, if you were in the agroecology program at University of Vermont, or you shopped at a co-op, or maybe you had a cousin who was converting the family farm or something like that, you might know about these things. But a few years ago, this regenerative agriculture concept, the story really started getting a lot of attention. I'll go ahead and make the text on the bottom there a little bit bigger, is an infographic from General Mills, right? And just one of many mass market food brands. that have started getting involved, certainly in regenerative storytelling, and hopefully converting their supply chains to regenerative methods. A few years ago, General Mills acquired Annie's Homegrown, and they've been making graham crackers and mac and cheese with regenerative organic wheat, actually some of which is grown on my friend Casey Bailey's farm in Montana. If you squint, you can see his name on the package there on the Honey Bunny grams. He was one of the farmers that I got to know really well for that Lentil Underground project that Katie mentioned earlier. And then the other way in which regenerative has gone really mainstream is these documentaries. I don't know about you, but if I'm on a plane or a bus or a train and the person sitting next to me asks me what I do and I say something about sustainable or regenerative organic agriculture, people will often say, "Oh, have you seen one of these films?" And Kiss the Ground has also kind of brought this topic of regenerative into celebrity culture and Hollywood, which has also become very apparent to me since I've moved to Santa Barbara to work at UCSB. I'm hearing about regenerative agriculture as part of that kind of culture around Hollywood. And then, the other way you might say that regenerative went big time, these kind of conversations at the IPCC. This is a special report from 2019 that really made the case that we cannot successfully address climate change just in the energy and transportation sectors, that the land sector is really important. And of course, agriculture is a really important part of that. So all of these things kind of converging to create a lot of momentum around the idea of regenerative agriculture as a climate solution, building up soil health, drawing down soil carbon, and this really being a significant part of global climate mitigation. And you had a lot of different takes on this from the research community. So on the one hand, this 4 per mill team, this huge international team of scientists, were pretty bullish on this idea, calculating that increasing soil carbon by 0.4% each year could offset 20 to 35% of greenhouse gas emissions caused by human activity. And this led the French government and others, and you see then Prince, now King Charles, kind of getting on board with this 4 per mill, 4 per 1,000 initiative. But then I'm sure some of you also noticed that there was another response in the research community, which was to say, whoa, let's try to stop this regenerative agriculture hype train. This soil health strategy may not actually do very much to store soil carbon or mitigate emissions. And so these were a couple of the commentaries that really stood out to me. And left me wondering, how much of a climate solution is regenerative agriculture? Can building up soil health on farms really take a decent bite out of that pie of global emissions? And if there's a debate here, is it about people talking about different kinds of regenerative agriculture? And if so, how do we make sure we're doing the kind that gives us the most benefits? So in 2020, in the depths of the coronavirus pandemic, I got to spend some quality time on Zoom with 4 regenerative agriculture leaders. And it was really an immense privilege to be in conversation with these folks to help me answer this question that had been nagging at me about whether regenerative agriculture truly could make a significant dent in the climate problem. And just to foreshadow a little bit, these 4 leaders showed me that indeed, regenerative agriculture, agroecology, building up soil health as a climate strategy, it can be an incredibly powerful climate solution, but only if we approach it in the right way. So I'll tell you a little bit about these folks. First, I met Latrice Tatsey, a soil ecologist from Blackfeet Nation in Northwest Montana, whose research focuses on the carbon sequestration potential of regenerative grazing. And like many regenerative grazing experts I've met, Latrice is a cattle producer who advocates for rotating livestock through pastures in patterns that mimic the movements of native herbivores, so as to regenerate vegetation and ultimately soil carbon. But for Latrice, native herbivores are more than just a theoretical model or a historical analog. Bison, or ini, as Latrice's people call them, are considered relatives and are central to the economy, diets, cultural, and spiritual traditions of the Blackfeet people, as they are for many people indigenous to the North American prairie. So Latrice isn't just using historical bison grazing as a model. She's part of an effort to restore bison on the North American landscape, and not just within the contemporary Blackfeet Reservation established by the US government, but throughout the historical territory of both her people and these native herbivores with whom they're so closely connected. And Latrice can rattle off a whole host of reasons why bison are needed to fully restore carbon-rich prairies. If you ever get a chance to see her at a conference, I highly recommend it. She'll talk about things like how bison graze selectively, and by doing this, create a diverse mosaic of vegetation across the prairie, which in turn supplies habitat for other species, including butterflies and endangered birds. And historically, when bison journeyed long distances, recently foraged vegetation had time to regrow before the animals came back. And this is really interesting. To adapt to grazing pressure from these massive herbivores, I mean, we're talking like 1-ton animals, prairie plants evolved to apportion a great deal of their efforts underground to support their extensive root systems. And these root systems, in turn, delivered carbon into the soil, where it could be bound up in minerals and stored for eons. So over the millennia, bison helped build up the North American prairie into some of the most carbon-rich earth in the world. But more fundamentally, Latrice explains, bison are not only a keystone species, but a teacher. Throughout their long evolutionary history on the prairie, they've learned to live in balance with their environment. And their movements and grazing behavior are a lesson for anyone who is willing to learn. Historically, Latrice's people heeded this lesson and amplified the bison's regenerative impact on the prairie by setting carefully timed fires. Now, Latrice has been studying bison grazing as a model for regenerative grazing, both of the restored bison that are coming home to Blackfeet Nation, but also to the cattle that many tribal members now raise. And going forward, she hopes that bison will be heeded for the even more profound lessons they have to teach about how to thrive on what is seasonally available and how to build a livelihood that's matched to the landscape. I also got to meet Olivia Watkins, who raises mushrooms within a patch of forest in North Carolina that her family has managed for more than 130 years. When Olivia's great-great-uncle bought the place in 1890, he became one of the first Black landowners in the area. In the midst of rampant racial discrimination and outright racial violence, during a century when 98% of Black landowners were forcibly dispossessed of their land, this forest plot was a place of relative sanctuary for Olivia's ancestors who initially lived off the land. And now, as the Research Triangle area of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill is rapidly urbanizing, Olivia's land is one of the few pockets of diverse natural forest remaining, and thus also a sanctuary for wildlife and soil carbon. So for Olivia, forest farming and agroforestry are a means of conservation in at least two senses. As she conserves threatened forest, she's also conserving threatened Black-owned land. And then closer to home, where I now live and work in California, I met Aide Guzman. Maybe some of you know her. She's also an agroecologist. She was conducting a first-of-its-kind study with immigrant farmers in California's Central Valley. So as Ivy Guzman explained to me, in order to effectively sequester and store carbon, soils, of course, need to have a diverse and vibrant microbial community. And in order to have all that biodiversity below ground in the microbial community, you also need biodiversity above ground in the plant community. Or so scientists believe, she told me as she was doing this research, because this was mostly based on research conducted in natural areas like forests. The question wasn't actually very well studied in agricultural landscapes in the US, Ade Guzman explained to me, because in major agricultural regions like California's Central Valley, where she was doing this research, there's not a lot of agricultural biodiversity to study. But Ida Guzman, she knew that there were hidden hotspots of biodiversity amidst the monocultures of almonds and grapes because she herself grew up in the Central Valley, the daughter of farm workers who immigrated from their family's diversified small farm in Mexico. And she knew there were many families like hers, families with deep cultural traditions of growing multiple crops in diverse mixtures or polycultures, families who were farming this way on whatever patches of earth they could find. So, using satellite maps and driving for hours down country roads, Guzman identified dozens of small farmers who agreed to participate in her study, comparing polycultures to monocultures. And the polycultures, Ivy Guzman found, provided much better habitat for specialist native bees. Pretty interesting, actually. Squash bees would rather have a polyculture than a field of just squash. Who knew? But she also took a bunch of soil samples, and this yielded some really interesting results. So the soil samples that Guzman analyzed from the polyculture farms had 2 times as many types of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, an indicator of that critical below ground biodiversity that's so important for carbon sequestration and other ecosystem services provided by soil. So again, Ida grew up in the Central Valley, and when she was growing up, she heard a lot of narratives about immigrants, not all of them positive. But as her data clearly show, the Mexican, Central American, and Southeast Asian farmers with whom she partnered on her research are literally bringing Central Valley soils back to life. And then one more person I got to speak with, actually just down the road from the little town of Firebaugh, California, where Ida Guzman grew up. Nikiko Masamoto cultivates 80 acres of peaches, nectarines, apricots, and raisin grapes as the third generation to steward her family's farm in Del Rey, California. Her grandparents bought the land and planted the first trees. Her dad, Moss, who some of you may know from his amazing books, converted the farm to certified organic production some 30 years ago. And walking the same land as those who came before her, Nikiko thinks a lot about her ancestors. Without that generational connection, Nikiko says, much of the soil building work on her family's land might never have happened. They might never have been able to do this soil building. Because when her dad decided to come back to the farm in the 70s, they planted trees her grandfather wouldn't have been able to tend on his own. And when Nikiko herself returned 3 decades later, that horizon for investing in the land expanded again. And she says, there's a gift of that, which is thinking of my life in a lineage that is much more important than my own individual life. So many of the methods that develop soil take time. The horizon is long. When you're wanting to leave a farm to several generations in the future, you have a vested interest in taking up those practices. But digging into her family's history is also a painful and complicated process for Nikiko. Discriminated against as immigrants, Nikiko's great-grandparents never owned the land they worked. What little savings they had built up to maybe allow future generations to do that was lost during Japanese-American internment, when some 120,000 people, most of them US citizens, were incarcerated for years simply because of their Japanese descent. So Nikiko's grandparents had to start from scratch, eking out a living on marginal land as they gradually built up the soil. As an aside, Nikiko she's got a 2-year-old who's just awesome. I got to meet her about a month and a half ago. And her middle name is Dynamite because Nikiko's grandfather had to use dynamite to break up this hardpan soil. So it's a tribute to remembering how determined the Masamotos were to build a life on this land, to literally invest in this soil, even though they didn't really have good reason to anticipate that they would have that chance to belong. And so this quote from Nikiko really stuck with me after interviewing her. She said, "We are the ones that the world needs in this climate crisis." And she was referring not just to Japanese Americans who've experienced internment in their lineage, but to all kinds of indigenous communities and communities of color who've experienced this land-based oppression. She said, because we have those stories. We have that sense of fighting against the impossible. So speaking to these four regenerative agriculture leaders filled me, honestly, with so much hope because each one of them laid out a powerful vision for how regenerative agriculture could significantly address climate change. And they were already putting these plans into action, restoring prairies, conserving forests, and demonstrating the benefits of planting polycultures and cycling nutrients. But they also made me think differently about what regenerative agriculture is and what it needs to be in order to truly address climate change and shift the destructive course of agricultural business as usual. And the first key lesson that I learned from these four folks is that regenerative agriculture isn't new. It's a new term that's getting thrown around. It often accompanies the word innovation. And yeah, strategies like cover cropping, regenerative grazing, these may be new ideas to some US farmers, many US farmers who've been taught that soil fertility comes out of a package and that monocultures are more efficient. But this industrial approach that often gets called conventional, right? It's only about 75 years old, which is really just a minor blip in the long history of human land management. And meanwhile, indigenous food systems have employed what we now term regenerative practices for thousands of years. Just as one example, on this continent, indigenous people have long understood the regenerative relationship among prairies, grazing, and fire. The African continent has a long history of agroforestry, a practice that continues throughout the African diaspora. Soulfire Farm co-founder Leah Penniman writes a lot about Black agroforestry in her book, Farming While Black. Maybe some of you have seen her present on this. And I love this term from geographers Judith Carney and Richard Razumov, who characterize African agroforestry as farmers transforming a rainforest into a food forest. Polycultures, of course, are also a staple of indigenous food systems in Latin America, and particularly this Three Sisters trio of corn, beans, and squash that spread throughout what scholar Devin Pena terms the indigenous corn belt long before European contact. And if you've ever wondered where organic farmers got the idea for their nutrient cycling practices, things like composting, mulching, and planting cover crops, one of the primary answers to that question is really smallholder farmers in Asia. Because when you look at these classic texts from the organic movement in the US and the United Kingdom, right, these books from Sir Albert Howard that inspired the Rodales and the beginning of Organic Gardening Magazine and the Rodale Farm, Franklin Hiram King's classic text, these are basically two scientists, Franklin Hiram King from Wisconsin, Sir Albert Howard from England, who both went and spent time with smallholder farmers in Asia and learned about their nutrient cycling practices. Sir Albert Howard got really into compost in India. Franklin Hiram King got really into living mulches and cover crops in Japan and China and Korea, and then brought that knowledge back to farmers in their own societies who were dealing with the kind of after effects of too much plowing, not enough return of organic matter over, several decades of an increasingly industrializing agriculture. So the organic movement really owes a big debt to this, nutrient cycling, traditional ecological knowledge in Asia. And these are just a few examples among many that I came across in the course of my research, and many more that I still have yet to learn about. But the key point, I think, when we're thinking about the regenerative agriculture movement in the US is really this, which is that regenerative agriculture is rooted in the ancestral knowledge of indigenous communities and communities of color. And it's essential to recognize, credit, and take leadership from peoples indigenous to this continent, Turtle Island, as well as regenerative agriculture leaders whose ancestors were indigenous to places like Africa, Mesoamerica, Asia, who are in diaspora and, like indigenous communities on this continent, have spent decades, sometimes centuries, on the front lines of extractive agriculture. And it's not just that all these communities are carrying these deep legacies of regenerative practices from thousands of years ago, but also that in these last few hundred years, when they've been on the front lines of extractive agriculture as exploited labor, as people losing land, drawing on ancestral knowledge, they've honed the practice of regenerative agriculture as a means of survival and resistance. So these have been living traditions that have been really relevant as the kind of, apocalyptic moment that maybe many people in dominant culture are experiencing with climate change came to these communities earlier. So there's a real need to, again, recognize credit and take leadership from these indigenous communities and communities of color. Yeah, that this isn't just ancient wisdom, that it has been really important in struggles for liberation. So just a couple of stories about that among, again, many, many, many stories. Arguably the first US scientist to reject industrial farming and call for regenerative organic approaches was Professor George Washington Carver, who began his illustrious career at Tuskegee University in 1897. So he was assessing the 10 acres that had been set aside for his new experiment station, and they weren't in very good shape. It was former plantation land, had been poorly farmed, was suffering from devastating erosion. So he realized that his first experiment really needed to be about demonstrating how to restore healthy soil on degraded land. This was what a lot of Black sharecroppers in the area were dealing with. And so this was going to be relevant research that people could apply right away. So he experimented with all kinds of ways of adding organic matter, utilizing barnyard manure, plant residue, soil building crops. And by 1905, so less than a decade, he managed to curb the erosion pretty dramatically, and it got people's attention. They were like, who is this guy? We need to learn from him. And what's interesting is that at the time when Carver is hired in 1897 at Tuskegee, these ways of adding organic matter weren't controversial. Like this was just agricultural science mainstream in the late 1800s to think about cover crops and adding manure and adding compost. These are the kind of recommendations you'd get from mainstream USDA folks advising farmers at all scales. But science was starting to move more and more into compounded commercial fertilizers, and an industry was growing up around it. And many, many people in the scientific community really cast their lot with this more industrial approach. But Carver was different as he saw colleagues, promoting fertilizer purchases or doing research that was funded by these companies. He kept doing his research on compost because he was worried that if he promoted farmers buying fertilizer, what that would mean for the people in his community is basically the Black sharecroppers would end up in debt to the white store owners and the white planters, undermining their chances for social and economic liberation. So he continued to think about what are the resources that the farmers I'm serving have access to, and how can they use cover cropping, crop rotation, and compost, which he really dove deep on the compost, which he termed nature's choicest fertilizer. And because he was doing this research, he was one of the first to really notice the difference between the kind of chemical approach to fertilization and the organic matter approach. This wasn't something that could be understood at the microbial level with the tools at that time, but he could see the difference. He actually wrote in a letter to Booker T. Washington that we know commercial fertilizers will stimulate and for a while produce good results, but by and by a collapse will come as the soil will be reduced to practically clay and sand. So George Washington Carver, right? I mean, more than 100 years before this contemporary regenerative movement. And he was, of course, drawing on an even deeper tradition of regeneration within the Black community in the United States. When Africans were enslaved and transported to the Americas, many reestablished indigenous African agroforestry practices in the form of dooryard gardens for daily subsistence. Braiding seeds into hair before the brutal Middle Passage, Africans brought staple foods with them, intercropping them with indigenous American plants that were incorporated into these dense, multi-layered home gardens. And these gardens, much like the work that Olivia Watkins is doing, they weren't just reservoirs of cultural survival and food security. they were also, as geographer Judith Carney writes beautifully, they were islands of agrobiodiversity disrupting a sea of commodity monoculture. So providing refuge to the non-humans displaced by the plantation system as well. And another story that really stuck with me after doing this research around how these ancestral traditions of regenerative agriculture and agroecology have been so central to liberation struggles is actually kind of the story of, the birth of the word agroecology and the field as a research field, as an academic field, and how central this person, Ephraim Hernandez Zolocotzi, is to that story. And so he was born in Mexico with an indigenous background. He was good at science, and so he ended up getting sent for an Ivy League education in the US. But he really wanted to go home and work in Mexico. And his timing was uncanny because he ended up getting hired to work for the newly formed Mexican agricultural program of the influential Rockefeller Foundation. So this was the program that would blossom into what we now talk about as the Green Revolution. But in the early days, it was actually more about supporting small farmers. There were people in that program who really believed in the Mexican Revolution and wanted to support small farmers growing subsistence crops, and were promoting things like cover crops and what George Washington Carver was doing. And so Zolocotzi signs up to work for them. And he's going around, he's gathering genetic material for their corn breeding efforts. And so he's all over rural Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. And he did indeed find an incredible diversity of corn genetics. And that's what the Rockefeller Foundation was seeking for their breeding efforts. But what most struck him wasn't the seeds, but the people who'd been selecting and planting them for generations. And that was what he realized was the real treasure of rural Mexican agriculture. It wasn't its genetic material, it was its people. And as the Green Revolution started to move more and more towards an input-dominated approach, Zolocotzi was pretty horrified by what that meant for the people who had shared their seeds with him, because what good were these improved seeds if they required chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation that peasants and indigenous people couldn't access? What good was a hybrid bred for the lowlands to a farmer living 5,000 feet above sea level? So Zolocotzi became more and more dubious about the efforts his seed collection was supporting as he watched this saga of agricultural development play out. Wealthy farmers using chemicals and irrigation subsidized by Rockefeller and the Mexican government exploited Mexico's lowlands, churning out record-breaking yields. Prices fell and markets dramatically restructured, undercutting the very small farmers who had so generously shared their seeds with Zolocotzi, really believing in his humanitarian mission. So he watched in horror as these small farmers were squeezed out of their livelihoods, jeopardizing not only one of the world's greatest living archives of agricultural diversity, but millennia of knowledge about how to raise these plants in balance with their surroundings. And so the star recruit of the Mexican Agricultural Project started speaking out and speaking proudly about his indigenous nominal heritage and questioning the doctrine that Mexico needed to be modernized. And so in 1978, he would co-host a landmark seminar, Agroecosystems, with an emphasis on the study of traditional agricultural technology, where the contemporary field of agroecology was born. So again, these are just a few examples among many that I came across in the course of my research. And there's so many stories about how Indigenous communities and communities of color have developed regenerative agriculture as a means of survival and resistance, and they're unfolding as we speak. And in the context of climate change, these communities again find themselves on the front lines of extractive agriculture, which both deepens the climate problem and undermines climate resilience. But now, while frontline communities suffer first and foremost, the whole planet is ultimately in danger. So it's really high stakes that we need to take leadership from these communities that already know all about regenerative agriculture as this strategy of survival and resistance. And this brings me to the other key lesson that I learned from talking with these regenerative agriculture leaders I told you about earlier, who, as you may have noticed, are all women of color. They encouraged me to be really clear about why we have an extractive form of agriculture in the US today. Not because it's efficient, not because it makes sense, right? It's because extraction is the playbook of colonization. All that soil carbon that was lost from US farmland over the past few centuries, that was part of a larger process of extraction, a process of stealing land, resources, even people, a process of exporting wealth out of communities and concentrating it in the hands of a powerful elite. Nearly all 30 million bison in North America were killed over the course of the 19th century, most of them in a particularly bloody 20-year period. And as land speculators in the US military understood, their strategy of exterminating most of these animals would profoundly undermine the way of life that had supported the people of the plains for thousands of years. And in place of these buffalo that had evolved with the grasslands, European American ranchers imported cattle, which had been domesticated in ways that made human management easier, but also necessary. So to accommodate the needs of their cows, these ranchers began modifying the landscape. They manipulated water, they grew feed, but most consequentially, they built fences, carving the West into discrete tracts of private property where forage could be assessed, bought, and sold as a capital asset. With federal coordination and financing, thousands of miles of fences were built, turning indigenous territory and open range into ranches. So in a landscape where survival had long required mobility, life was now frozen in place. And it was frozen in place for the people that had stewarded these lands as well, because simultaneously, indigenous people, those who'd survived the military campaigns intended to kill them, were rounded up and confined within the boundaries of reservations. These newly designated territories covered merely a tiny fraction of these people's ancestral homelands, often places that were habitable only in particular seasons. And they were told it was for their own good, their own protection, that they'd be more productive in settlement than migration. And in the early 20th century, these attempts to, quote, modernize both the people and the landscapes of the American West were so tightly intertwined that Indian affairs and range management were often overseen by the same officials. They sought to homogenize and standardize, to make life legible so that it could be readily managed. They carved up interdependent communities into discrete individuals, erecting literal barriers between formerly connected lives. And in place of self-determining groups, they sought to create what Chief Justice John Marshall termed domestic dependent nations, populations that could not survive on their own, but must submit to hierarchical control. So what happened to soil carbon on these grasslands has everything to do with this colonial project. And this was not the only time lands would be taken. At the close of the Civil War, as the nation wrestled with how to incorporate nearly 4 million formerly enslaved people into the fabric of society, a group of Black ministers had actually a really good idea. And they approached Union General William T. Sherman and requested an allotment of 40 acres for each freed Black family. The general actually agreed, and he issued Field Order Number 15, which would forever be remembered as the promise of 40 acres and a mule. But shortly thereafter, President Andrew Johnson rescinded the order, and in the decades that followed, white Southerners would attempt to recreate both the economic and political conditions of slavery by any means necessary. Many Southern states passed laws prohibiting Black people from owning or even leasing property. Frequently, the only option available to Black farmers was sharecropping, an exploitative system that was manipulated by white planters and merchants to keep Black farmers in debt. And when Black families did manage to acquire land, they frequently faced severe discrimination and outright violence. More than 4,000 African Americans were lynched between 1877 and 1950, and many of them were landowners who were targeted for upsetting the racial hierarchy of white supremacy. And despite all this, Black farmers kept gaining ground. And by 1920, there were 925,000 Black farmers who owned the land they farmed. But that's when the financial racism started. So the Great Depression devastated the agriculture sector in the US. My family experienced this as well, spurring the first major federal programs to support farmers. But these programs, and critically, the low-interest loans they offered, which were an absolutely necessary safety net for farmers recovering from this total devastation of the sector, these low-interest loans were administered through local committees that in the South were dominated by white planters whose worldviews really hadn't changed very much since Reconstruction. So many Black farmers were flatly denied the government loans to which they were entitled. Applications were thrown in the trash unread. Black applicants could be kept waiting for hours when white constituents were served. And even when loans were provided to Black applicants, they were smaller than those offered to white applicants with similarly sized farms. And the result of this thinly veiled onslaught of financial racism was a tidal wave of foreclosures and tax sales, which ultimately proved more devastating to Black land ownership even than the violent mobs of the early 20th century. Between 1950 and 1975, 500,000 Black farms went out of business, forfeiting a total of 6 million acres just in the years between 1950 and 1969. Journalist Van Newkirk calculated what this meant on a daily basis. An average daily hemorrhage of 820 acres, an area the size of New York Central Park, erased with each sunset. And despite the warnings of Efraim Hernandez Zolocotzi and his colleagues, the US and Mexican governments pressed forward with the Green Revolution in Mexico, with devastating impacts on traditional farming systems. Whole families abandoned their rural villages, agrobiodiversity declined, and formerly self-sufficient in corn, Mexico became a net importer of the staple grain by 1970. Food prices began to rise, and thousands of financially insecure farmers like Ide Guzman's parents sought work as farm laborers in the United States, where they were systematically denied full citizenship. And this practice of exploiting displaced immigrants was not new, as in fact, waves of immigrants from Asia had had a similar experience. In late 19th and early 20th century California, the story repeated itself with one Asian immigrant community after another. Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Punjabi. They came as farm workers. They hoped to become farmers. They carried all this agrarian wisdom, but they were systematically denied access to citizenship and land ownership, ensuring that agribusiness would always have access to a pool of legally insecure laborers. So this obviously is not a playbook for justice, this colonial legacy of industrial agriculture in the United States. But it's also not a playbook for ecological survival or responding to climate change. Ecological survival requires reciprocal relationships between soil and plants, plants and animals, and ultimately between people and land. I talked with a lot of soil ecologists for this research. I was really interested in this question of, how much carbon can we draw down through soil health practices? And the answers that people gave to that question and in these wide-ranging conversations about agriculture as a climate solution, they all centered around this common refrain about roots. And whether these were people who study soil building cover crops, people who breed perennial grains, people who work to help ranchers optimize grazing strategies, all of these ecologists, I noticed they were really fundamentally after the same goal, which was how can we keep living roots in the ground all year round? So roots, they literally are made of carbon, right? So they're going to die, they're going to slough off, you're going to get carbon. But they also secrete a lot of carbon in the form of exudates that feed soil microbes. And this carbon that's exuded by plant roots, it's labile. It's easy for microbes to digest. And as a result, carbon from plant roots is 5 times more likely than above ground carbon to be stabilized as organic matter in soil. Carbon from roots is where it's at if we want to make an argument that agricultural practices can really shift the balance of carbon dioxide from atmosphere in the soil. got to have living roots in the ground all year round, right? A regenerative agriculture clearly must be a deeply rooted one. And yet, we look at this history of colonization and its extraction playbook. This is a history about uprooting both people and the plants they tend for hundreds of years. So that, I think, is really the question, is how can these extractive processes of colonization be healed? How can we ensure that people are able to put down roots? So just to briefly recap, right, we know that food systems currently account for a quarter to a third of greenhouse gas emissions. And regenerative agriculture strategies rooted in agroecology, these can potentially transform farming from a climate problem to a climate solution. And the key word is potentially. We know that these techniques that are often discussed under the umbrella of regenerative, things like agroforestry, regenerative grazing, and cover cropping, aren't new, that they're rooted in ancestral traditions of indigenous communities and communities of color, where they find a much deeper and more transformative expression than a sort of a la carte check the box for whatever practice. We also know that these communities have identified colonization and its extraction playbook as the root cause of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. And they've been working for hundreds of years to fundamentally transform these relationships. But one of the most problematic legacies of colonization is a big impediment to this transformation, which is that 94.4% of US agricultural land is white owned. Much of it now, by institutional investors, right, and private equity. And this isn't an accident. It's not just a recent development, right? This again builds off of hundreds of years moving in this direction of indigenous communities being dispossessed of land. 98% of Black agricultural landowners dispossessed of their land over the course of the 20th century. And although slavery was abolished more than 150 years ago, we know that agricultural labor in this country is still largely performed by non-white people who are systematically denied full citizenship in US society and rarely have the opportunity to own land, no matter how hard they work. So there's all these stories about how many people who live right here in the United States carry these incredible legacies of regenerative agriculture know-how that go back generations and generations. People want to do this, but how on earth are any of these people supposed to practice the long-term strategies necessary to regenerate soil carbon? So as I was kind of finishing up this project, thinking about where to conclude this book, where to land this story, I was really struck by a new generation of land trusts that aim to combine the advantages of a community land trust and a conservation land trust. One of them in the Northeast, many of you probably know these folks at Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, who have a vision for using these vehicles as a means of gaining land justice for Indigenous communities and communities of color, so that these farmers who do carry these legacies have the opportunity to practice these things on the land, and that it's not just cultural appropriation by dominant culture of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, that the people who follow in these lineages really have the land access to put down those deep roots and benefit their communities and the climate at the same time. So as many of you know, Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust negotiates equitable leases for farmers of color, vetting landowners to ensure that terms are fair and that the place and relationship provide a safer space. And long-term, they have this goal of acquiring more land with the goal of providing affordable long-term leases to dozens of farmers of color who commit to regenerative agriculture covenants. But I think also a really important thing about how this group works is that they don't do anything without first consulting the Indigenous communities who are the original stewards of the land. They use this tool called a cultural respect easement, which stipulates specific forms of Indigenous access or Indigenous informed management of land. So as a hypothetical example of this kind of easement, Stephanie Morningstar, who's the co-director, explained that a Vermont landowner in Abenaki territory might have a number of ash trees on their property. And the Abenaki who make traditional baskets using ash trees might negotiate an easement with the landowner who could agree to call a designated representative whenever an ash tree fell, so that the Abenaki could harvest it. Or these easements could grant access for hunting, harvesting, ceremony, reburial of ancestors, or simply be open to ongoing definition by the nation. There's a similar group that formed in California in 2020, co-founded by Neil Thopper and Mai Nguyen, that also has this vision of acquiring land through a land trust, providing access for farmers of color. In California, that often looks like farm workers who want to own their own farm, oftentimes forming cooperatives, and then working in partnership with indigenous communities so that this land is both being rematriated and made available to farmers of color for their livelihoods at the same time, and really finding synergy between the needs of indigenous communities and farmers of color who are in diaspora. Aide Guzman and Nikiko Masamoto are involved in similar efforts here in California, working to advance indigenous sovereignty and at the same time ensure that immigrant farm workers in California have opportunities to become farm owners. Latrice Tatsy is also doing really exciting land justice work, working to bolster land sovereignty at Blackfeet Nation, returning bison to their complete migration patterns, which means a lot of land outside the current boundaries of the reservation. And Olivia Watkins is president of Black Farmer Fund, which is building wealth for Black farmers and food businesses, quote, to repair Black communities' relationship to food and land. So, just to close here, I think ultimately what I've learned from all of these regenerative agriculture leaders is that regenerative agriculture isn't just a menu of discrete practices that you can tally up into a sustainability score. It's a bold project to reshape our society's relationship with land and with each other, if you really take that word regeneration seriously. Over the past 500 years, agriculture on this continent has been a process of brutal extraction, and the scars are as present in our climate of racial injustice as they are in the gigatons of soil carbon lost to the atmosphere. So near the end of my interview with Stephanie Morningstar from Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, I ended up asking her this really fundamental question about, what is the climate crisis? What does it require of us? Because before she started this job, she was doing climate change research at a university in Canada. So I thought she'd be the person to ask. And this is what she told me. She said, this is ancestor work. Everything that we're doing is ancestor work. Not just me, not just Black folks, not just people of color, everybody. So climate change signals a profound imbalance rooted in the violent restructuring of relationships between people and land that lies at the very heart of this continent's history. And this rupture disrupted the connections that make healthy, functioning ecosystems possible, including the connections that weave humans into the fabric of a place. And so that means the vital work of rebuilding soil carbon is inextricably woven together with the vital work of racial justice. And I'm going to close with Stephanie's words here. She said, what we are doing is we are healing our ancestral lineages. It's about going back to the root issues: Indigenous land dispossession and enslavement. How do we right those relationships between our own communities so we can heal those things in this healing ground? So I asked her, I said, okay, so healing the climate means healing land, and healing land means healing colonization. She said, that's it. That's the work. So that is Healing Grounds. Thank you so much. I know that was a lot and that was a long time, and we're on Zoom. I so appreciate you hanging with me and looking forward to any questions or comments or anything that you want to share.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was amazing. I read your book when it first came out, and yet it was still so powerful to kind of hear all of that in your own words and with the images of the farmers and activists who really inspired your work and whose stories you're amplifying. Um, So yeah, like Liz said, we have a good chunk of time now for questions and to be in conversation with each other. And if you want to just like pop your name in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute, we can kind of see how it goes. Doesn't need to be a really formal thing. All right, I see Cheryl Carmi's hand is
I'll
up.
also just say I'm happy to talk about like methods and process too. I know we've got a lot of researchers and storytellers, and this is pretty complicated as a white female academic thinking about how I can write this book in a responsible way. So I'm happy to talk about those things too, and nothing's off the table.
Can we make sure we like I'm gonna, as the facilitator, make sure we save some time for that at the end.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so Cheryl.
Um, well, sure. And here, a white middle-aged lady just stepping right in first. All right, Karen checking in here. Actual Karen behavior, not our delightful colleague Karen. Um, but I wanted to ask where you see where you're deriving hope, like where are people in positions of power and influence acting for good and acting for decolonization methods. Yeah, that's what I'm excited about is how we're navigating that tension and who we can look to learn from and how to do that.
Yeah, I see people in all kinds of positions of power at all scales of, institutions or influence. Um, I would uplift Cory Booker and the Justice for Black Farmers Act as a really exciting piece of legislation to come out of the Senate that is beyond, I think, probably anything that's come out of Congress since maybe the Reconstruction era in terms of this vision of actually making good on that broken promise around 40 acres and a mule. I love the vision that he puts out of an equitable land access service within USDA. As we all know, there's a generation of farmers retiring. If nothing happens on a policy front, a lot of that land is probably going to go into private equity and isn't really going to serve the needs of the communities or public health or sort of the public interest. I love the idea of state and federal level programs to purchase that land and then use a vehicle like the Equitable Land Access Service to redistribute that land to new entry regenerative farmers so that the next generation of agricultural landowners better reflects the demographics of the country. So I would say at the federal level, I'm really following that work from Cory Booker. It'd be so great if that was incorporated into the Farm Bill. He's got it out there as a marker bill. All the language is there. So that's definitely something I ask my senators here in California to take a look at.
Thank you. Next I see Molly Anderson.
Thanks, Katie. Liz, you were remarkably uncritical of regenerative agriculture, and many people object to the way it's been co-opted and the
Yeah.
way that General Mills and Pepsi and other companies have used it as a carbon offset without any intention of lowering their own emissions, truly, which maybe funnels a little bit of money to farmers, but doesn't do all that much for climate change, which really depends on lowering emissions. So how do you deal with that? And how do you deal with the fact that the US government seems to be far more receptive to regenerative agriculture and actually farmers are far more receptive to that than they are to agroecology, which actually has so many benefits that go beyond carbon sequestration. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, good point, Molly. And I think for folks out there for whom the term regenerative is bankrupt, I totally understand that perspective. And I think that's one way to respond is to say, nope, not this term. It's being used in too many ways that are greenwashing. We need to invest our energy in other terms like agroecology or like organic that we feel have some integrity because they're either backed up by a movement in the case of agroecology or by a legal standard and a movement in the case of organic. I think the word regeneration, if we take it seriously, points us to agroecology and points us to a unified social and ecological movement for healing. I think that actually a lot of the farmers who identify with the term regenerative, that's what they're hearing, including a number of farmers and land stewards that I've spoken with who have not felt they don't necessarily identify as organic. They don't necessarily identify with agroecology, but somehow this word has reached them and has resonated with something deep inside them. It's not that General Mills gave them the idea, it's that regeneration helps name something that they are doing. And so I think that there is I'm just out here trying to invest this word with as much meaning as possible, basically, because I think we're still in a moment where there is a possibility of like Leah Penniman as the poster child for regeneration and Latrice Tatsy as the poster child for what regenerative really is. And I think with all of this money flowing to regenerative from climate smart commodities, and who knows what Kamala Harris might do if she gets elected, right? There may be another moment of money flowing to regeneration. That as much as we can do to say, hey, if we want to do this right, if we want to actually meet the goals that this movement has around climate, we need to do ecosystem restoration, not just a little no-till here and a little cover crops here. And we need to do this in a socially robust way. So I think that's the kind of piece of a larger complex puzzle of public discourse and advocacy that I'm sort of taking up at the moment, is I see this as a new enough conversation, a new enough terminology that the conversation hasn't sort of solidified and become rigid yet. So that's my hope. Folks who know me, I'm already a little bit naive and Pollyanna-ish, so that's probably an expected approach that I would be taking. But I'm grateful for, my collaborators in movement work who also see the dangers of co-optation, and certainly the folks I know who've watched, the NOP process from the beginning are, full with cautionary tales about how these things can go. Yeah.
Thanks for bringing the tough questions as always, Molly. And yeah, thanks for that really honest answer, Liz. It occurred to me when you were talking that also, thinking about the words that you closed with from Stephanie, that this is ancestral work, that there's also that aspect of generational, just right within the word of regeneration. And so I felt some resonance there as well when you were speaking.
Mikiko brings that forward all the time. She's like, I don't know about this regenerative agriculture, but generational means something to me.
Anissa.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks so much, Liz. I'm Anissa. I'm a postdoc at IFA, just started. Wanted to thank you so much for your presentation. You covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciated the historical narratives that you were bringing forward. And I was just reflecting on, the role of us as researchers in really elevating invisibilized and marginalized histories that really show us how structural inequities and injustices have become institutionalized. Because sometimes we're just in this situation where we see all the injustices, but understanding how they came about and really elevating the complexity of those stories is so important. And now we're working, many of us, on elevating efforts and narratives to address, subvert, and undo some of these structures of injustice. So I suppose maybe this is too tough of a question, but if you have any thoughts, and I was kind of thinking about that and then wondering if you could reflect on the role of researchers in going one step further and really helping to support structural changes in those systems of power that we many of us have access to, or sometimes greater access to. So things like funding flows or policies or regulations, because lots of big changes need to happen. And, and you said the statistic about land ownership in the US is really mind blowing. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, my approach to storytelling is, of course, very individual, as it is for every storyteller. This is a practice that I love, that I've loved my whole life, and have been lucky to get to train with a variety of people, from songwriters to journalists. And so I use a form of storytelling, narrative nonfiction, kind of inspired by science writing, where individual stories are a way in to larger stories. And that has pluses and minuses. The politics of that are very complicated, right? If an individual is going to stand in for the story of a community, that's something to take a lot of care with. And there's always something lost in that process. But I think the benefits of that way of storytelling is the way in which we all get to know each other as individuals in our everyday lives. And so I think of the way that, Nikiko or Olivia or Latrice or Ida's stories function in this book is that they're the kind of guide for the reader. They're like your field tour guide through these larger histories, and it can feel a little bit more intimate. You can connect with that personal story. So that's a way that I go about storytelling. I feel a really deep sense of responsibility to anyone that I ask to play this role of guide in stories that I craft. And so I think a lot about what reciprocity looks like. I mean, obviously, this doesn't happen without serious consent. It involves hours and hours of work together. In the case of this book, all of that work was paid. So interview time was paid for the folks who worked with me in this book. Time reading the manuscript to make sure everything was accurate was paid. And we formed a committee to talk about what to do with the resources that came from the publisher. It's not a huge advance. I'm not like a big famous writer, but we got $17,000 and we were able to put it towards the We the Land conference that actually just happened. So that is an approach that, comes with a lot of relationship responsibility, but I think I've heard from readers over the years that they feel a connection. And it's really generous of people like those 4 women to be willing to kind of be in that role in a story. When I'm using that approach, what I try to do is start by introducing this person. I want the reader to connect on the things that we as human beings have in common. I think that a lot of the white farmers that I've worked with in the past can connect actually with the way that Olivia wants to honor her ancestors' connection with her land and take good care of that place for the next generation. So I am introducing the story in a way that I'm bringing the reader into, this is a person that you're going to cheer for through this whole chapter. You want this person to win. And then I'm going to leave them after the story has started, wondering how it's going to come out. And then in the middle, I'm going to offer this history and this context to understand why what this person is doing is so remarkable. It's even more remarkable than you thought when you started, because look what she's been up against for generations. And so then when you get to the end of it and you get that win, you're thinking, oh my goodness, this is so significant. I want this for other people. So that is the way that I've approached things. I'm really inspired by folks in the environmental justice community who talk about an asset-based approach. And that's part of why I want to lead with people and their change-making efforts. And I want to be honest about the structures that people are up against, but I want the people to shine through their struggles with those structures. And I feel like, 99% of readers I talk to, that's what they're looking for. They're thinking about, how do I make a difference with my life? And I feel like, Olivia, Latrice, Ide, Nikiko, these are role models, for like my students, people that they say, they look at those lives, they say, those are really good lives. I want to live like that. How can we do structural work? So many different ways. I think it's amazing to be part of a group, right? So hard to do this on your own. Vermont, right? There's just so much amazing organizing groups that tackle federal policy, state policy, nitty-gritty stuff at the county level. Here in California, I joined the CalCan advisory, California Climate and Agriculture Network. They do amazing work on state policy, and they ally with all kinds of other groups. So my own individual capacity, both in terms of what I know about state policy and just like my skill set around politics and things, is like this. But when I joined join with the larger CalCan group, I can tell you about lots of big wins, California Farmer Equity Act, things like that. So I think it's sort of finding the maybe one or two groups that you're really going to invest in. And yeah, we can all be a big team. Some of us working on federal policy, some of us working on state policy, some of us working on cottage food laws, or county policy to make land access better. So yeah, it's good work, and we don't any of us have to do it all.
Oh, that's such an important reminder, Liz. Like,
It's hard because we want it to change now and it's so urgent. But look at all these people. We've got a big, awesome crew involved in this work. So yeah, we can have each other's back.
I love that. All right, I think we've got time for one last question. And I'm gonna hand it over to Carly Moore.
Hi everyone. I'm Carly. I'm a PhD student at Stanford, and Liz, I've seen you on campus before. Um, I work at the intersection of agriculture and tribal governance, and something that I spend a lot of time thinking about is um, do we have to start with folks who are bought in emotionally? Like,
Mm,
or can we start with people who are trying one practice or another practice from a list and like come
mm.
to a place where they're bought in? And I feel like sometimes in the agroecology or regenerative space, we can be very bought into like one specific way of approaching things. And I wonder how you found this in your conversations.
Yeah. I think there are so many entry points. I think the land is the greatest teacher. I read Robin Wall Kimmerer talking about that. Latrice spoke so much about this, that she really admired the work that her dad had actually done to bring buffalo home to Blackfeet Nation. And she felt that growing up around those buffalo, she didn't need to read a book about this. That it was the experience of being on the land that really taught her so much. And so I think, like you say, maybe someone's entry point is trying a practice off a list. Maybe there's an incentive to try something for water quality, or who knows what the entry point is. But I think people do find so many different kinds of meaning in why they might want to be involved in agroecology or soil health or regeneration. Some people have entry points around health. Some people have entry points around different kinds of environmental issues like water quality or soil erosion, or whatever's impacting them in their community. Some people have economic entry points. It may be that their commodity market just sucks and the prices have been getting worse and the buyer is shit to deal with. And it would be nice to have an alternative market to sell into, and that market is requiring a certification or something like that. So I'm with you. I don't think we should get too hung up around a particular entry point. And I'm also with you that the more ways we can think of for this movement to feel open and welcoming, rather than like a club that only people who are part of a certain culture get to join, I think the more successful we'll ultimately be.
I wonder, Liz, if I'm just gonna abuse my facilitator powers. If you can spend maybe just a couple minutes before we close, talking about what you brought up at the beginning of the Q&A around just like kind of methods, and you've talked a bit about it already. But yeah, just how you kind of approach this type of research and the role of researchers, how you navigate your positionality in all of this. I think that's something that a lot of people listening would kind of benefit from hearing your take on.
Yeah, I mean, this is also one of these lifelong learning processes. I remember when I was in graduate school at Berkeley, I asked this question of all of my mentors all the time. And I had my notebook out and I was so ready to be like, oh, please, will you just give me the 10 steps to like be a responsible researcher? And they would always put it back on me, and I was like, oh, this is challenging. Because I think the basic principle around reciprocity in research we share, and it's really sound. And it is something that we each have to figure out for ourselves, and continually so as our lives and our careers evolve, because what we have to offer is going to shift and what we're asking is going to shift with different projects. And so I think it's just really important to reflect on that ourselves, is like, how are we designing research with reciprocity already in mind? And then when we start to work with collaborators, having conversations with them that allow to surface what reciprocity looks like for them. And I think for me, the outcome I always hope for with a project is that I've designed those reciprocity systems well enough that whatever benefits come from the work are aligned with what my collaborators need and what they've articulated they're looking to move toward, and that those benefits are flowing directly to them and not disproportionately to me. And so there's the financial piece of that, which I described a little bit earlier, to try to make sure that financial resources from the project were flowing to them. A piece of that was in the first couple of years after this book came out, there were some speaking engagements and some media work. And so all the folks featured in this book articulated sort of what they were and weren't interested in. And the well-paid speaking engagements, for the most part, went to the women in the book. Sometimes I would appear with them, but unpaid, with them receiving honoraria. And then I would do unpaid things that they articulated kind of a general way. I wasn't like, I'm going to go to you every time I get an invitation, but it was like, what are the kinds of things that you would like me to do that feel helpful to sort of share, circulate, uplift this story? But a piece of the goal was to make sure financial remuneration came back to these folks. But another really big piece is there's a reputational and kind of professional advantage that comes from something like a book project. And I wanted to make sure that, to whatever degree that was involved, that this project was helping these folks move where they wanted to go in their careers. And something that I'm just so excited about is that Latrice Tatsy was hired like a year ago now as the tribal conservationist for Blackfeet Nation through NRCS. So she is the lead person for NRCS at Blackfeet Nation, with a direct line of communication to their state leadership in Montana. And what she's able to do that's so cool is, when we were chatting for the book, she had this role with a Native-led nonprofit where she worked with all these amazing producers that had traditional practices for soil health, agroecology, sort of ecosystem restoration on their lands that were not easily fitting into the NRCS boxes for practices. And she would go to the NRCS office and say, will you please give this person a contract? Like, what they are doing is helping watershed health or helping organic matter. And it was hard. But now she's the person sitting in that chair who can make those decisions. And she's helping the state of Montana to think through how they can do, how they could adjust their idea around NRCS practices to fit traditional ecological knowledge held by Native nations in Montana. So that, to me, that's the kind of thing that I hoped would come from this book. And so I think, in terms of setting up research in a reciprocal way, it's sort of how to align whatever the dynamics are of the specific project. In the case of the book, it has to do with these questions around money and paid time and the advance and speaking engagements and media. But other kinds of projects and also other kinds of career stages are different. Like with Lentil Underground, I didn't even have dissertation funding. I was a grad student. I had no money. I couldn't offer people money, but I could do the dishes and I could do childcare. I took care of some young turkeys. What I was trying to do there was like time reciprocity, basically, is if I'm asking for your time in an interview, what can I do to compensate you for time with my time? Because that was the sort of currency that I had at that time. So yeah, I think just that basic principle of continuing to work towards reciprocity, keeping an open line of communication so that you can hear the things that you didn't think of that might be impacting someone. And yeah, I mean, we can just continue to grow into these methods continuously. Never any of us are going to have it like figured out.
Thank you so much, Liz, for sharing your time and your insights and wisdom, and the wisdom of the people that you have cultivated these relationships with. We're all so grateful. I'm just gonna share my screen really quickly in our last minute. And Reed posted in the chat. Reed, maybe you can post again for folks. We do have another PowerUp coming in a few weeks. I'm sure Liz is going to be a tough act to follow, but I think that our speaker, Jasper Singh, is going to be a great follow on. Liz, I hope you can join us. And that will be focusing on the power of photo voice methodologies and kind of how to navigate that and how to apply it in the context of research for social justice. And we also have another Let's Eat seminar focusing on the development of the master's program at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. So that's in about a month, and there's QR codes there on the screen. And we will also be sending around flyers for those, just like we did for this. So opportunities to register for those events as well. Thank you everyone for joining. And thank you again, Liz.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, everyone. So good to be with you today. My
So
heart
good
is
to see
full.
you.